Now updating analysis software mode, cross-game comparison software initiated. Subject, easiest game. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the difficulty analysis series, where today we are looking at which Pokemon game was actually the easiest. Yes, today we actually have 3 game waves we are going to be looking at for the difficulty analysis series, which game was easiest. Those 3 game waves are Generation 1, Red, Blue, and Green, Generation 6, X and Y, and Generation 7, Let's Go. This comparison will be less of a team comparison and more of an analysis of these games in particular. To understand why these games are here in far more detail, we have the videos on those, which we're going to be linking. But to be brief, they were the 3 games that were easier than both their predecessor and their successor. As for the case of Generation 1, it was specifically less difficult than the game that came after it. Of course, Generation 2, Gold, Silver, Crystal, was more difficult than it, so it by default is easier than the game that came after it, so that's why it's here as well. Now, let's get into these games. The interesting thing is that there's actually a lot of common threads between all of these games. They have actually very weak stats and moves on almost every team of Pokemon, especially at the point in the game, specifically level-wise. The Pokemon either lack stab or lack a high-powered stab, or are unevolved significantly well past the point in the game that they should be evolved at, or incomplete movesets. Let's Go and X and Y are particularly guilty for this, because many of the moves actually did exist, but were simply not given to these teams. Many teams of importance, in fact actually most teams of importance in these games, actually have a majority of 3 Pokemon or less. More teams have 3 or less Pokemon on them than the teams that do. Again, this pairs up particularly poorly with the lack of good moves on these teams and the overwhelming availability of such good moves for the player. It is extremely easy to outmuscle these teams just on a pure numeric basis. Generation 1 is a bit less guilty of this, as those moves were both not as available or simply did not exist at this point, so there is a bit more of a leeway in there. Many of the Pokemon do have somewhat closer to the best things that they could. Even if they don't have the best, they have somewhat closer than they could. One thing in favor of Let's Go as opposed to Gen 1 is that these teams are actually better, even if they are not the best in terms of moves. There is an upgrade, even if not all of that great, which would make things a little more even. Better stabs and coverage, of course, will do that, and in the case of X and Y, numerous Pokemon do actually have fantastic movesets and stats, but these are generally 1 per team, if they're the case at all. And when they're on a team of generally 3 or less to maybe 4 Pokemon, this heavily undermines the abilities of the good Pokemon, and the increased number of battles simply dilutes down this strength. The original games, due to how few battles there actually were, the strength is actually not diluted down as heavily when there are difficult battles, but also at the same time, the weaker battles will weigh a little more. The same actually does apply to Let's Go. The other thing to also consider is, of course, the quality of available Pokemon. When it comes to Generation 1 and the Generation 7 Kanto games, the quality of the Pokemon is actually relatively poor for most Pokemon, both you and the AI, because the Pokemon of Kanto are just generally not overly strong. They do have some of the lowest stats in the series. And this does put things at a relatively more even pace. The extremes of average what Pokemon are going to be are not as high in Kanto compared to the later games. So stats are relatively more even. The same is not true of Kalos, where because of the sheer number of available Pokemon, the quality of those Pokemon on average will be significantly higher than the quality of what the enemy teams have. So there's a much more generalized, overwhelming stat advantage present for Kalos in terms of the player. There's also the presence of the abilities in Kalos, which do aid many Pokemon. Abilities are meant to make Pokemon stronger, and that is exactly what they do in Generation 6. Generation 7 and Generation 1, there are no abilities present though, so again, this does kind of elevate Callus a little bit into the easier section, but also does a little bit more difficult because, again, counterbalancing. Things for the enemies are made stronger, but so are you. Bit of balancing. But there is one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and it actually makes everything we've mentioned here completely obsolete. And this is the badge boosts. These were only present in Generation 1 relative to the other games. And this is a 12.5% boost to the player's stats. It is an unavoidable inclusion. Unlike something like Megas, which can be discounted and reasonably be discounted, these are a fundamental component of the game that you are required to get and you can't simply ignore and turn off. They are omnipresent, and this is a factor in determining difficulty. But this factor docking Generation 1, it can't be numerically quantified, can it? Actually, it can, and I have actually calculated it. And actually, due to the way in which percentage modification boosts and debuffs are applied, we can actually take the badge boost's percentage, convert that into a debuff, and apply that to the enemy teams to numerically calculate a factor of difficulty decrease. The reason why I am able to do this actually relates to the change in which how the abilities boosting the starters moves is applied. In Generation 3, the ability of Blaze, Overgrow, and Torrent boosted the special attack of starters' special attack by 50% when using a same type attack bonus move when at low health. Because the changeover into Generation 4, where the physical special split happened, this was instead converted from a stat boost into a move power boost. And the effect was instead to boost the base power of those type of moves when a Pokemon is using them at low health, when the ability is active, by 50%. So say you're using Water Pulse on a water type that has Torrent activated. It will treat that Water Pulse as a 90 base power move before same type attack bonus is considered, rather than a 60 base power move, because to account for the fact that physical or special moves can now happen. And the reason why both are still boosted by 50% is because the changeover of the 50% attack boost to the 50% power boost, the change was negligible. Meaning, fractions of percentages, meaning we can treat them numerically as the exact same. A change in one is equivalent to the change in the other, because the badge boosts are numeric multiplicative stat boosts. We can apply those as numeric multiplicative move boosts for the player. Because a multiplication is the exact same as division, we can simply apply the opposite to enemy moves to get a debuff. So a stat buff to you can be applied as a stat debuff to the enemy, and a stat debuff to the enemy can be transferred onto their moves as a move power debuff. So we can numerically calculate the base power of the moves that the enemy is using, normalized to the modern game base powers. I know it's a bit rock and sciencey math here, but the short and simple answer is, numerically, we can figure out what the base power of moves in Generation 1 were when converted into modern games with the stat boost being applied to the player. So, this pretty much outweighs anything due to the sheer influence of a, 1/8 boost, which when converted to the enemy is a 1/9 debuff. And yes, we did mention that many moves in Generation 1 were of relatively poor quality, but this was for many of the lesser used typings. There were still significantly high-powered moves for many of the common typings. Moves like Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, Earthquake, Rock Slide. These moves did exist, and these are types frequently used by the enemy teams. Even moves like Petal Dance or Giga Drain at least have significant power above the rest of the series. The moves that had very weak power were things like Fighting, or Bug, or Poison, or Ghost. These were types that really were not heavily used by the AI teams. The teams heavily used by the AI did have access to good quality moves, but they simply were not given. Up until the Elite Four and even well into the Elite Four, you're dealing with moves of base 60 power or less stabs. And again, this continues even into the Elite Four until you get to around Lance and the Champion, giving these games the benefit of the doubt at a average stab base of 70 base power and a non-stab base of 80, which again is extremely generous on average considering most ones are well below this power and they only spike up with the base 120 power options that blue gets. As a decrease for the enemy teams comes out to a modern stab equivalent of 72.2 base and a non-stab of 71 base. Again, in the exception of the 120 base power Hydro Pump and Fire Blast, of course, which only are used by blue, comes out to a 106.7 base power. That is a power that is just below 95 base power counterpart move that the player has. When, of course, factoring in the boost, this is because the defensive boosts of you were applied as an offensive debuff for them, so your offensive buffs are still preserved. That comes out to a conversion of 106.9. That means a Charizard that you have, equivalent level to Blue's Charizard, using Fire Blast while you are using Flamethrower. You are doing more damage with a lower base power move because of the massive influence of those stat boosts. Again, a 1/8 boost to every move power is equivalent to this. That means that your Earthquakes are not punching at 100 base power. They're punching at 112 base power. It's kind of insane. Even though both X and Y and Generation 7's Let's Go games are quite easy, as we have gone over, they do, at the very least, have competent base power stats that are significantly above this. Generation 4 and Generation 3 as well pretty much established the hard and fast rules of the standards for what power moves enemy teams are going to use. That's generally 80 to 90 base power moves, both for stabs and non-stabs. And both X and Y and Let's Go very much are in line with this. Their stabs are significantly more powerful, 80 to 90 bases with 90 to 80 base coverages. Sometimes higher, sometimes a little lower, but in the cases where it is a little lower, it's generally not a base 60 power move. It's maybe 70, 75. So it's still quite close and still is higher than this game, really. Again, the only outliers in this are the notable outliers, like, again, such as Blue's Fire Blast and Hydro Pump, and Lance's Hyper Beam, which one or two moves compared to every single other fight in the entire game simply doesn't compare. This is where one of those things of this pure numbers and pure experience really come head to head. One of the reasons why Generation 1 is considered so difficult, despite the overwhelming numeric superiority you have, really just comes down to, well, player inexperience. It came down to just not knowing. The level jump between, well, the 8th gym and then fighting Blue at the end of the game is a colossal leap in levels. And also, there was just no good place to really train in this game, so most people either didn't know to go train up until, like level 65, or simply didn't want to. So you were fighting at a disadvantage, and that's where the real difficulty experience comes from. Punching at a massively under-leveled disadvantage. Even though the huge stat boosts will compensate to a degree, it doesn't compensate enough for maybe a 10, 20 level difference. But considering the way in which we are analyzing the difficulty, even level, and we are disregarding the amount of grind time necessary, this becomes completely irrelevant in the case of Generation 1. We're only looking at the actual fights. Are these fights of good quality considering every factor at play in the game? when it comes to pure mechanical on an even level. And that is where this game fails. It's because of that huge, overwhelming numeric advantage the player is given. This game is by far the easiest. Even X and Y, as we've gone over, is quite easy, but at the very least, it has very substantially high-powered moves on many members of its teams. Let's Go, which again was also a very, very easy game, still has pretty high-powered moves with good stabs in many cases. A modern equivalence for this game would essentially be if Psychic type Elite Four or Gym Leaders were using a move such as Confusion, or Spark, or Flame Wheel, Water Pulse at the end game, when they're using moves like Surf, Scald, Shadow Ball, Sludge Bomb, Psychic. It's not even comparable. It's a 20 base power difference, maybe even a 10 base power difference doesn't really seem all that significant, but it is incredibly significant, since it is a default advantage or disadvantage. Again, one of the reasons why the newer games will feel easier compared to the old ones is just because of player experience. We now know what moves in stats are. We know to go out of our ways to get TMs. We know that to give a Pokemon Bubble, as opposed to giving it Surf or Ember over Flamethrower, is not a good idea. It is also understanding the separation of physical and special. Giving a special attacker like Alakazam a move like Pound, which I don't think it can, but again, example, or giving a ground type like Rhydon Surf. Using a physical attacker with special moves or a special attacker with physical moves is an understanding that people just simply have back then. And that is really where most of this application of the older games were harder comes from. It comes from just not understanding. To phrase the badge boost in a bit of a different light, if you convert the 1/8 stat boost you are receiving into a 1/8 level boost, considering again level 65 for the opponent, because of the way in which stats work, you can approximate that as a 1/8 of your level increase, so a 12.5% level increase. That would put you roughly at the level equivalent for stats at 71 to 72 compared to level 65, at which point your stat boost percentages are now removed in place of now the level advantage. There are so many ways to say the same thing, really. It's, again, we're going over the exact same thing in just different ways. Even if we included the EXP All change that was made in Let's Go, there is no way Let's Go would over-level you almost 6 to 7 levels above them. Maybe 1 or 2, but not 6 or 7. Contrary to the games having gotten easier over time, they have actually gotten harder over time, as the original games were the easiest. It's just, again, going back to player experience, simply not knowing and not understanding how everything works. Now, people who've been playing these games for 20 years, 25 years, they can build a team that actually works decently well like the back of their hand. Back when they played the first time, which is what they use as their reference point for experience, they didn't know how to do any of this. As well as just simply not knowing when to level up, as opposed to just the game truly being difficult. It's either conscious player choice to not want to spend their time level grinding, or just impatience at not wanting to level grind and not knowing what's going to come, and then paying for that by being at a disadvantage. That's not on the game, that's on the player, either through conscious or uninformed decision making. And a game really shouldn't have that stigma because of, well, a player mistake. But none of the easiest games have actually been tackled. Next time, we'll be looking at what game was actually the hardest.